What dark, ancient secret lay hidden behind the haunting eyes of the Lady Ligeia? How did a cold, gold-encrusted bridal chamber transform into the stage for the most terrifying resurrection in literary history? Classic Storytime Hub presents a masterpiece of Gothic horror by the legendary Edgar Allan Poe, Ligeia. Please note that this timeless tale has been reimagined and rewritten in English to offer you a fresh, immersive perspective on Poe's most haunting work of art. I can't say when, where, or exactly how I first encountered her, Ligeia. The memory drifts like smoke, hazy, fragmented, as though years of suffering have blurred the edges of my own life. Perhaps it isn't lost. Perhaps it simply slipped past my notice quietly as her presence, her mind, her beauty, her voice crept into me so slowly, so imperceptibly that I never realized I was already captivated. I think it must have been in some ancient crumbling city by the Rhine, its streets heavy with history and shadow. Of her family I remember only whispers, hints of a lineage stretching far into the past, but all that fades when I speak her name, Ligeia. Even now the sound alone conjures her before my eyes, the woman who was my friend, my partner in thought, my confidant, and eventually my wife. She is gone, yet calling her name draws her spirit from the void as vividly as if she still stood beside me. And yet, I have never known her family name. Was it her playful secret? A test of my devotion, or some strange offering of my own, an act of romantic worship, a gift of blind, fervent passion? I do not remember. How could I? All details, all reasons, dissolve into the mist of memory. Perhaps it was fate, or some shadowy spirit of romance guiding our union, as if the heavens themselves had orchestrated a marriage whispered in ill omens. But one thing remains clear, sharp against the haze of time: Ligeia herself. Tall, graceful, and even in her later days unnervingly thin, she was a figure of intellect and ethereal beauty. Every movement, every word was charged with an almost unnatural intensity, a presence that left me both enchanted and unsettled, as if I were in the company of something far greater than life itself. I could never fully capture the quiet majesty of her presence, the effortless grace, the almost supernatural lightness of her step. She moved through a room like a shadow slipping across walls, entering and departing without a sound. I knew she was there only by the soft, low music of her voice brushing against me, or the delicate touch of her hand, cool and marble-like, resting on my shoulder. No maiden I have ever seen could rival her face. It shone like something born from a dream, an opium-laced vision, ethereal, untethered from reality, more wildly divine than the fantasies that haunted the daughters of Delos in their slumber. And yet, her beauty did not conform to the rigid patterns taught in the classical studies of old. As Bacon wisely said, no exquisite beauty exists without a trace of strangeness. Ligeia's face was perfect in ways I cannot define. There was a strangeness woven into her features that made her otherworldly, yet I could never trace it precisely. Her high, pale forehead seemed carved from ivory, commanding yet serene, its quiet majesty almost unbearable to behold. Her hair, raven black, glossy and naturally curling, framed her face like a dark halo, fully deserving of the Homeric praise of Hyacinthian. Even her nose held a perfection I had never seen nowhere else save in the delicate art of ancient Hebrew medallions. Smooth, subtly aquiline, nostrils curved in harmony with the rest of her features, an unmistakable mark of freedom and spirit. Every detail of her face spoke of intelligence, of passion, of something beyond mortal comprehension. I lingered on her mouth, that divine curve that seemed to capture the triumph of heaven itself. The delicate lift of her upper lip, the soft, sumptuous rest of the lower, every dimple, every subtle blush spoke a language of its own. Her teeth caught the light in flashes that seemed almost too brilliant for this world, and her smile, that smile radiated a serene, almost sacred joy, one that could lift the spirit and unsettle the mind all at once. And her chin was no less captivating, broad yet gentle, soft yet majestic, a perfect balance of fullness and ethereal grace. It was a line the gods might reveal in dreams, a vision of divine form glimpsed for a fleeting moment by mortals unworthy to hold it long. And then there were her eyes. Eyes like no others, without precedent in the annals of history or art. Perhaps the secret of her ineffable beauty lay there, as Bacon had hinted, that indescribable strangeness that marks the extraordinary. They were larger than ordinary human eyes, even fuller than the most perfect gazelle eyes from distant lands. Yet the difference was subtle, only truly apparent in moments of intense feeling, moments when her gaze seemed to lift her above the world, as if she belonged to a realm beyond earth, a beauty akin to the fabled houris of legend. Her eyes were the deepest, most luminous black, framed by long, jet-like lashes and brows of the same mysterious hue. But the strangeness, the thing that haunted me, that seized my imagination, was not in their size, color, or brilliance. It was in their expression, that elusive, almost forbidden quality that defied words. Ah, words, so feeble, so insufficient. How often have I spent hours, entire nights, attempting to decipher that gaze? How have I lain awake through summer nights, straining to grasp its meaning, only to find the mystery deepening with every heartbeat? The eyes of Ligeia were more than eyes. They were portals, mirrors of something eternal, something no mortal could fully understand. What was it? What depth lay hidden behind her gaze, deeper than any abyss philosophers ever imagined? What secret waited inside the pupils of Ligeia's eyes? I was consumed by the need to know. Those eyes, vast, radiant, almost sacred, became twin stars in my private cosmos, and I devoted myself to them like a reverent astronomer charting the heavens. There is no mystery of the human mind more unsettling than this, the way memory teases us with its nearness. We sense a forgotten truth hovering just beyond reach, standing at the threshold of recall, yet it never fully arrives. Again and again, as I studied Ligeia's eyes, I felt myself on the brink of understanding their expression. I could feel the knowledge approaching, breathing against my thoughts, only to vanish at the final instant, leaving nothing but longing behind. And then, stranger still, I began to encounter that same sensation elsewhere. After Ligeia's beauty had taken residence within my spirit, like a sacred relic enshrined in memory, I started to recognize echoes of her gaze in the most ordinary corners of existence. I could not define the feeling, nor dissect it, nor even stare at it directly without losing it, but I knew it. I felt it while watching a vine grow with restless urgency. I sensed it in the fragile flight of a moth, the silent patience of a chrysalis, the endless murmur of running water. It surfaced in the vastness of the ocean, in the sudden blaze of a falling meteor. I glimpsed it in the eyes of the very old, those who seem already halfway removed from this world. Even the stars betrayed it. There is one in particular, a faint, shifting star near Lyra, that awakens the feeling whenever I study it through a lens. Music, too, could summon it. Certain trembling notes from stringed instruments, or a passage in a book that struck with inexplicable force. Always the same sensation, always familiar, always unreachable, and always, inevitably, it led me back to the eyes of Ligeia. Among countless moments that etched themselves into my memory, one stands out, a passage I once read in a volume by Joseph Glanville. Perhaps it was the archaic cadence, the weight of its words that struck me so. And the will therein lieth, which dieth not. Who knoweth the mysteries of the will with its vigor? For God is but a great will pervading all things by nature of its intentness. Man doth not yield him to the angels, nor unto death utterly, save only through the weakness of his feeble will. Years of reflection have revealed to me a subtle connection between this idea and Ligeia herself. That immense, unyielding will, hidden beneath her serene exterior, was the engine of her being. In thought, in word, in deed, it pulsed with a force that rarely needed to announce itself, yet its presence was unmistakable. Of all the women I have known, she, placid, calm, seemingly gentle, was secretly consumed by the fiercest passions. I could only measure them through glimpses, the sudden, miraculous widening of her eyes, both dazzling and terrifying, the low, melodious tones of her voice, serene yet vibrating with an almost supernatural clarity, the sudden fire in her words, a violent energy made all the more striking by the usual softness of her manner. And then there was her mind. Her intellect was astonishing, unlike any woman I had ever encountered. She commanded the classical languages as effortlessly as breathing, and no European tongue could escape her mastery. Topics that would have left the most celebrated scholars faltering, she handled with ease, as though her mind were a vast and uncharted domain where nothing was impossible. It strikes me now, with a thrill that borders on fear, how extraordinary this aspect of her nature truly was. To claim her intellect was unmatched among women feels insufficient, almost mundane. For what mortal, no matter how learned, could claim mastery over the endless landscapes of moral philosophy, mathematics, and the sciences, as she seemed to do with effortless authority? Ligeia was a mind of infinite depth, a will of immense power, a presence that could enrapture, terrify, and command attention all at once. And beneath it all, the calm exterior, the serene facade, hid a storm that only those who truly looked could ever hope to perceive. At the time, I could not fully grasp what I see now with painful clarity. Ligeia's knowledge was not merely vast, it was colossal, almost unimaginable. And yet even then I sensed enough of her supremacy to surrender myself with a childlike trust to her guidance. She led me through the tangled labyrinth of metaphysical studies that consumed the early years of our marriage, a world chaotic, unfathomable, and terrifying to a lesser mind. How intoxicating it was, that slow unveiling! How my spirit soared as she leaned over my shoulder, showing me vistas of thought previously hidden, long untrodden paths that seemed to stretch toward a wisdom too rare, too sacred to be fully grasped by mortal hands. Every revelation felt like a glimpse of the divine, a forbidden treasure made real by her presence. And then the cruel descent. Gradually, imperceptibly, my hopes began to falter. Without Ligeia, I was lost, a child stumbling blindfolded through the shadows. Her guidance alone illuminated the dense mysteries in which we dwelt. Without the radiance of her eyes, the golden letters of our studies dulled to the heavy gray of lead. She grew weaker. Her once blazing, otherworldly eyes burned with ferocious brilliance, yet beneath that fire her body waned. Pale fingers took on the translucent waxen hue of the grave. The delicate veins on her lofty forehead pulsed visibly with each subtle tide of emotion. I realized then what I had dreaded most. She was dying. And yet even in that frailty she resisted. With a strength and fury that astonished me, she struggled against the inevitable, against Azrael, the angel of death himself. I had believed from the stern majesty of her nature that she would meet death without fear. How wrong I was! Words cannot convey the intensity of her struggle, the violent, desperate energy with which she fought to cling to life. I groaned at the spectacle, torn between awe and despair, as the woman I loved wrestled with forces that no human should ever confront. I would have tried to soothe her. I would have reasoned with her, but in the blazing intensity of her desperate desire for life itself, all comfort, all reason were meaningless. They would have been folly. Yet even in the last, most convulsive thrashings of her fierce spirit, the serene exterior she carried never fully broke. Her voice softened, dropped to a low, haunting murmur, but even in that quiet there was a wild, terrible meaning I dare not dwell upon. My mind spun as I listened, enraptured to a melody that was more than human, to aspirations and passions that mortal hearts had never known. That she loved me, there was never doubt, but even in life I had only glimpsed the surface. It was in the shadow of death that the full, staggering force of her devotion revealed itself. For hours she clung to my hand, pouring out a heart so overflowing with love that it seemed closer to worship than mere affection. How had I deserved such a blessing? How had I been cursed with her departure in the very hour of its confession? I cannot dwell upon this. Words fail me. But I recognized at last the driving force behind her will, her intellect, her astonishing energy, this wild, untamable longing for life itself. It was a passion beyond reason, beyond description, an urgent, desperate fire that no mortal voice could convey. And then, in the high hours of the night when she knew the end was near, she called me to her side. There, with a peremptory command that brooked no refusal, she bade me recite certain verses she had composed only days before. Trembling, I obeyed. The words were these: "Behold, tonight is a gala night within these lonely fading years. Winged angels, cloaked in veils and drenched in tears, sit silently in a cosmic theater, watching a play of hope and dread, while the orchestra breathes softly, a music drawn from the spheres themselves. Mimes, in the image of God on high, whisper, mumble, and flit to and fro. Puppets, mere shadows of something vast, invisible forces shifting the stage, their wings unseen, their cries of woe carried through the void. Oh, that motley drama! It will not be forgotten. A phantom is chased forever, grasped at, yet never caught, looping endlessly through the same circle, while madness, sin, and horror compose the very soul of the plot. But look, amid the chaos, a crawling shape appears, a blood-red thing writhing from the depths of the scene. It twists, it writhes with mortal agony. The mimes, helpless, fall prey to it, and even the angels weep as vermin fangs tear into human flesh. Out, out go the lights. The stage collapses into darkness. A curtain, like a funeral shroud, descends with the roar of a storm, and the angels, pale and wan, rise and unveil the truth. The play is humanity itself. The hero, if hero it may be called, is the conqueror worm. "Oh God!" Ligeia shrieked, springing to her feet, her arms flung skyward in a convulsive gesture as I finished reading the lines. "Oh God, Divine Father, must it always be this way? Shall the conqueror never be conquered? Are we not part of you and you part of us? Who truly knows the strength of the will? Man does not surrender fully to angels nor to death, except through the weakness of his feeble will." Then, as if drained of every particle of life and spirit, she let her white arms fall and returned solemnly to her deathbed. Her last breaths came in soft murmurs, almost imperceptible. I bent close and heard, faintly but unmistakably, the echo of Glanville's words. "Man doth not yield him to the angels, nor unto death utterly, save only through the weakness of his feeble will." She was gone, and I, crushed under the weight of grief, could no longer endure the lonely, decaying city by the Rhine. Though I was wealthy in worldly terms, Ligeia had bestowed upon me riches far beyond what any mortal could hope for. After months of aimless wandering, lost in sorrow, I purchased an old abbey in one of the most remote, untamed corners of England. Its gloomy grandeur, the wildness of the surrounding land, and the weight of centuries of melancholy perfectly mirrored the desolation I carried within me. The abbey's exterior, draped in green decay, I left largely untouched, but inside, perhaps in a childlike defiance, perhaps in a faint hope of easing my grief, I indulged in splendid extravagance, adorning the halls with a magnificence that bordered on regal. Even in childhood I had relished such displays, and now, in my grief-stricken dotage, they returned to me, a fragile attempt to reclaim joy from the shadows. Alas, I can now see how even the faintest seeds of madness might have been sown in the lavish, fantastical draperies, the solemn Egyptian carvings, the wild cornices, the ornate furniture, and the dizzying patterns of tufted golden carpets. I had become a captive, enslaved by opium, and even my commands and labors reflected the shadowy logic of dreams. But these indulgences of the mind I will not linger on. Let me speak instead of the one chamber forever cursed, the room to which, in a moment of mental alienation, I led my new bride from the altar as the supposed successor of the unforgotten Ligeia, the fair-haired, blue-eyed Lady Rowena Trevanion of Tremaine. Every detail of that room remains vivid in my memory, and yet how could the proud family of the bride allow a maiden so beloved to enter an apartment so grotesquely adorned, driven only by the lust for gold? Though I remember the chamber with minute clarity, its design defied logic and pattern, offering no foothold for reason or memory. The room occupied the high turret of the castellated abbey. Pentagonal in shape, it was spacious yet claustrophobic in its extravagance. The southern face of the pentagon was dominated by a single enormous window, a seamless pane of Venetian glass tinted with a leaden hue. Sunlight or moonlight streaming through it fell with a ghastly radiance, casting an eerie glow on everything within. A tangled vine clambered across the upper trellis, crawling up the thick stone walls as though feeding on the darkness itself. The ceiling soared above, a towering vault of gloomy oak, intricately fretted with grotesque carvings, a marriage of semi-Gothic imagination and druidic fantasy. From its central recess, suspended by a single chain of gold, a massive censer in Saracenic design. Its perforations were crafted with such fiendish art that colored flames wriggled and flickered like living serpents, casting a spectral dance of light across the chamber. Scattered throughout the chamber were a few ottomans and golden candelabra designed in an exotic Eastern style. And there was the bridal couch, low, Indian in design, carved from solid ebony, with a pall-like canopy suspended above it. In each corner of the room stood gigantic sarcophagi of black granite, brought from the tombs of ancient kings near Luxor, their lids carved with weathered, immemorial reliefs that seemed to watch over the chamber with silent authority. But it was in the drapery, the curtains, the canopy, the carpeting, even the coverings on the ottomans and ebony bed that the true phantasm lay. The walls, impossibly tall, were swathed from floor to ceiling in massive folds of the richest cloth of gold, adorned with arabesque figures, each about a foot across, worked in jet-black patterns. Yet the terror of the room was in the design itself. From any single viewpoint, the arabesques appeared simple, even grotesque. But as one moved through the chamber, the patterns shifted, revealing an endless succession of ghastly, writhing forms conjured from Norman superstition or the guilty dreams of monks. Every step altered the vision, every glance brought new horrors to life. The effect was amplified by a constant, deliberate draft behind the heavy drapery, animating the tapestries as if the monstrous forms themselves were breathing, wriggling, alive. The wind gave the chamber an uneasy, almost sentient motion, turning the walls, the bed, and the shadows into a living nightmare, a haunted space where the imagination could scarcely find rest. In halls such as these, in that accursed bridal chamber, I spent the first month of my marriage with the Lady of Tremaine. The hours were unhallowed, yet curiously serene. I could see that my wife feared the violent moods of my temper, that she avoided me and loved me little, but this displeasure gave me a dark satisfaction. I loathed her with a hatred more demonic than human, and yet in the same breath my mind was flooded with the memory of Ligeia, the beloved, the august, the beautiful, the entombed. I reveled in the perfection of her purity, her wisdom, her ethereal grace, and the idolatrous fire of her love. My soul burned with a passion even greater than hers, fed by opium and obsession. In the dream-haunted hours of night, or amid the secluded glens by day, I would call her name aloud, as if my desperate longing could restore her to the world she had abandoned, to the very earth she had left behind. Could it ever be? Could she return? By the beginning of the second month, the Lady Rowena fell suddenly ill. Her recovery was slow, her nights restless, her half-sleep haunted by murmurs of strange sounds and movements in the turreted chamber. I dismissed these as the figments of her fevered imagination, or perhaps the phantasmagoric influence of the chamber itself. She regained her health for a time, but it was brief. A second, more violent illness struck her, leaving her frail and permanently weakened. From that moment her attacks became frequent and alarming, defying the skill of the most learned physicians, and leaving her body fragile, her presence shadowed by the unseen hand of fate. In deepening chronic illness, so too did the fragile instability of her mind. Even the smallest noises, the slightest movements set her trembling. She spoke again, and with increasing insistence, of sounds in the chamber, of movements among the tapestries that seemed to move of their own accord. One night, near the close of September, she pressed the matter upon me with a desperate urgency. Just roused from a troubled sleep, her emaciated face worked in the dim candlelight with anxiety and dread. I sat beside her ebony bed, on one of the Indian ottomans, watching her. She partially rose and whispered, low and intense, of noises I could not hear, of movements I could not see. The wind rushed behind the heavy draperies, stirring them, and I tried, though even I doubted the explanation, to convince her that the subtle breaths of air caused the shimmering changes in the patterns on the walls. But her face, drained of all color, told me any reassurance would be utterly useless. She seemed on the brink of fainting, and no attendants were near. I remembered the decanter of light wine prescribed by her physicians and hurried to fetch it. Yet as I stepped beneath the ghastly glow of the golden censer, two strange things struck me. I felt something, palpable yet unseen, brush lightly past me. And there, on the golden carpet, caught in the eerie radiance of the flickering flames, lay a shadow, faint, indefinite, almost angelic in shape, like the fleeting silhouette of a spirit or a shade. I was lost in the frenzy of an opium-induced delirium, and paid little mind to the strange events I had just perceived, saying nothing to Rowena. With the decanter in hand, I crossed the chamber again and poured a goblet of wine, holding it to her lips. She had partially regained her strength and drank on her own, while I sank onto an ottoman, my eyes fixed upon her fragile form. It was then that I became aware of a soft footfall on the golden carpet near the bridal couch. And in the very instant Rowena raised the goblet, I saw, or perhaps only imagined, that 3 or 4 drops of ruby-red liquid fell into the wine, as if summoned from some invisible spring within the room itself. Rowena saw nothing. She drank unhesitatingly. I said nothing either, convincing myself it was only the malformed fancy of an opium-addled mind, stirred by the lady's terror and the hour's shadows. Yet I cannot deny that immediately afterward her condition worsened with alarming rapidity. By the 3rd night, the hands of her attendants prepared her for the tomb. On the 4th, I sat alone in the chamber, my bride now shrouded, surrounded by the same strange, fantastical horrors that had first welcomed her. The towering sarcophagi in the corners, the shifting patterns of the golden draperies, the writhing, multicolored flames of the censer above. My eyes then sought the place beneath the censer where I had seen the faint shadow days before. It was gone. I drew a slow, trembling breath and turned my gaze to the pale, rigid figure upon the bed, feeling the oppressive stillness of the chamber press in from all sides. Then a flood of memories of Ligeia swept over me, crashing upon my heart with the full force of a grief I had never known, the same unutterable woe that had once consumed me when I gazed upon her still form. The night dragged on, each moment heavier than the last, and I remained fixed in a relentless vigil, my thoughts poisoned with bitter remembrance of the one supremely beloved, while my eyes never left the body of Rowena. Time lost all meaning. Midnight? Earlier? Later? I could not say. Suddenly, a soft, unmistakable sob broke the silence, startling me from my morbid reverie. It seemed to come from the ebony bed itself, the bed of death. I froze, trembling, straining to perceive some movement in the corpse, but the body lay still, utterly still. And yet I knew I had not been deceived. I had heard the sound, faint but real, and it awakened my soul with icy dread. I kept my gaze locked upon her, paralyzed with terror, until I saw it. A faint blush, barely perceptible, spreading across the sunken veins of her cheeks and eyelids. Horror struck me so completely that my heart skipped, my limbs stiffened, and for a moment I felt incapable of motion. But duty, or some last tether of reason, restored me to myself. I could no longer deny the truth. Rowena still lived. I needed to act. Yet the turret was isolated, far from the servants, and leaving the room would cost precious minutes I could not spare. Alone, in that accursed chamber, I prepared to confront the impossible, to call back the spirit that hovered faint and uncertain between life and death, with nothing but my own hands, my own will, and a desperate hope that the impossible might yet be undone. In a short while, it became terrifyingly clear. Rowena had relapsed. The faint flush of life vanished from her cheeks and eyelids, leaving a pallor even colder than marble. Her lips shriveled, pinched into the ghastly mask of death. A clammy chill spread across her skin, and the full rigor of mortal illness returned, as if summoned by some invisible hand. I recoiled in horror, collapsing onto the ottoman, and surrendered once more to fevered visions of Ligeia, my mind drowning in obsession and grief. An hour passed, and then, could it be? I became aware again of a vague, almost imperceptible sound from the bed. I strained my senses in terror. The sound came again, a soft, quivering sigh. Rushing forward, I saw it clearly this time, a tremor on her lips, and a heartbeat, a glimmer of life stirring beneath the stillness. Her lips parted, revealing a line of pearly teeth, and I was thrown between amazement and awe, my reason staggering under the impossible sight. A faint glow appeared on her forehead, along her cheek and throat. Warmth began to seep into her rigid frame. The pulse of life returned, faint but undeniable. She lived. I threw myself into the work of restoration with desperate fervor, massaging her temples and hands, applying every technique my knowledge could suggest. But it was in vain. The color fled once more. The pulse vanished. Her lips resumed the icy expression of death, and in an instant her body became rigid, cold, and lifeless again, every trace of vitality replaced by the chilling, loathsome stillness of the tomb. Once again I sank into fevered visions of Ligeia, and once again a soft, almost human sob came from the ebony bed. But why linger on the endless horrors of that night? Why dwell on the repeated, impossible revivals, each more terrifying than the last, each relapse into death more absolute, more hopeless, each struggle seeming a battle with some invisible, relentless foe, each moment leaving the corpse altered in ways too grotesque to describe? Let me hasten to the end. Most of the night had passed when the dead one stirred again, but now with a vigor far beyond anything I had witnessed, rising from a dissolution more appalling than I had thought possible. I had long since ceased to move, sitting rigid upon the ottoman, trapped in a whirlwind of emotion where awe itself was the mildest torment. The body moved, slowly at first, then with increasing force. Life's hues bloomed in the cheeks, the limbs relaxed, and except for the heavily closed eyelids and the grave's shrouds clinging to her, it might have seemed that Rowena had truly broken free from death's fetters. And then my doubt vanished. The enshrouded figure, rising unsteadily, eyes still closed, stepped forward with the bewildered, unsteady gait of one caught between sleep and waking, and advanced palpably into the center of the chamber. The impossible was before me. The dead had walked. I did not move. I did not speak. My mind was flooded with 1,000 impossible thoughts, each more maddening than the last. The figure before me, its posture, its very presence had frozen me in place, paralyzed, chilled to stone. Could it truly be Rowena? Could the fair-haired, blue-eyed lady of Tremaine stand alive before me after all that had passed? Doubt clawed at me. The bandages around her mouth, could they conceal the lips of the breathing woman? The roses of her cheeks, pale yet full, might still be hers. The dimples of her chin, as in health, could they belong to her? And yet, had she grown taller in sickness? The thought struck me like lightning, a madness I could not resist. With a single frenzied bound, I reached her feet. She recoiled slightly, and the ghastly cerements that had bound her head fell away. From the cascading, disheveled mass of hair that poured forth, blacker than midnight ravens, I recognized what I had feared and hoped all at once. And then, slowly, the eyes opened, wild, obsidian, untamed, eyes that spoke of eternity, of death and defiance intertwined. These are her eyes!" I screamed, my voice tearing through the chamber. The full, the black, the infinite eyes of my lost love. The lady, Ligeia!
And thus the story ended. If you liked this journey into the worlds of classic literature, do not forget to support us by subscribing so we can tell you more. And hey, if there's a classic tale you'd love to hear told in this suspenseful style, drop its name in the comments below. Your suggestion might be our next chilling adventure.